Last 2 weeks we talked about time, and we talked about the different meanings in time for when change takes place. Today we're going to talk about mechanisms of change. Now, when you think about mechanisms of change, okay, in therapy, it's almost like, what are you talking about? Everybody knows the mechanism of change is that you talk about your kishkas, and you become emotionally engaged, and you think a little differently about your emotions, and you understand them better perhaps from the past and from your dreams, and then you change. So what's this talking about mechanism? What's this, of course, in psychoanalysis? And the answer is that the mechanism of change in families is a different mechanism. One of the things that makes family therapists different from other therapists doesn't mean exclusively, because what we just said, that also happens. But what's different in family therapy is to appreciate the mechanisms of change that take place between people and not just in people, okay? Which includes trying to understand how people bring within a family, it's within groups too, but we're talking about families, how people create the possibility of change. People create change with pain. Nobody changes without pain. But we're talking about the mechanism of the pain. And the mechanism of the pain is something that's called a symptom. Now, what does that mean? A symptom is a protest in the simplest understanding, because there's like reality, there's how things have been, how things are supposed to be, how we like to see how things are, and something is outside of the usual, right? Remember we talked last time about the insider and the outsider? We said that when something that's supposed to be inside the family, one of the family members is doing something like from outside of the family, so there's a protest. There's a protest about what's going on. Is it working? Is it working well for everybody? Is it working well in time? Is it sustainable, if you want to say, for the future? And so a symptom has two levels of meaning. The first level of meaning is let's fix it, right? That would be the usual way that medicine thinks about a symptom, and that would be the usual way that sort of common sense, you would say, well, if somebody's not sleeping well, let's have them sleep well, right? Or you can say there's a reason somebody's not sleeping well, because something is happening between us, not just in the person, but between us, which needs attention. And when that's given a different kind of attention, and the way that we are between us is able to change, the person will sleep well. And that's a different way of looking at it, because we're not talking about what's bothering the person, we're talking about what's bothering the group. What is it in the family that needs more attention now? Last two sessions we talked about now. When is that now? What happens in the family? So let's have a look at the original symptoms that came to Rashbi Sasson, Sigmund Freud, in the late 1800s. Freud's clients were mostly younger women, and they were mostly having very florid symptoms that we don't see in that form right these days. People suffer more slowly these days. People are in slow cookers. In Freud's time, there was cultural change, and people were in fast cookers. So people sort of blew up, and there were these hysterical symptoms. And so let's look at a family with a hysterical seizure. Hysterical seizure, now, why would a hysterical seizure go to Freud? Because he was a neurologist. Freud was not a psychiatrist. He never studied psychiatry. He read it, what little there was to read. But Freud was a neurologist, and he began with people with neurological symptoms. People came in, they couldn't move the left side of their body. People came in and were having seizures. And some of them, with the primitive ways that neurologists looked at things then, you couldn't figure out why they were having seizures. You couldn't locate it, and it seemed like a somewhat different seizure. So the question was, does it have an emotional meaning? You see, Freud was always talking What he thought he was doing is he was dealing with the interface between the body and the mind. This whole question of body and mind. Freud thought he was working always at the interface between the body and the mind. It turns out we're working at the interface of the body, the mind, and the group. Freud didn't see the group. So let's see what he used to see. So we have this 15-year-old who has been okay up until now. Been okay up until now means no symptoms. And so things are okay, right? And then she starts to have hysterical seizures. Now, Freud would say, okay, who was making you anxious in the sexual realm when you were 3? That would be one way of looking at it. And then you would have to explain why that happened when she was 3 and now she's 15. You have a different way of looking at time, which is that the family maybe is ready for change. So if you recall, when we began the first lecture, we talked about multiple function. And the reason we talked about multiple function back then is to prepare us for this lecture, so that we can say a symptom does many things all at once, right? Somebody will come to you with the headaches, and you won't say, what is the meaning of the headache? You will say, what are the meanings of the headache? It works on a variety of ways. And if you recall, we set up this 4x2 table. Remember that there's an expression of something in the instinctual realm, and the ego is reacting to it, so there's a tension. There's something in the realm of the conscience which needs to be expressed, and the ego is trying to modify it. There are things going on in the real world, and there's what's called the compulsion to repeat, which is just saying that things repeat themselves sort of naturally. So there's going to be a drive that's going to be expressed and being restrained, and the superego is being expressed and being retained. Now, that's inside the person. But if we look at this family, we see, we don't ask the girl, what are your dreams and what are you feeling? We say, when you have a seizure, what happens? What happens after the seizure? What is the seizure making happen? And that's a way in which the symptom is proclaiming itself. By showing what happens when you have a seizure, the symptom is telling you something if you listen the right way. So it turns out that when I have a seizure, my mom says to my grandma, sorry, I can't have tea with you for 5 hours today because I must go to the hospital where my daughter is suffering. Oh, tell me something about your grandmother. Well, after Grandpa died, Grandma sort of, was very lonely. And this was a small Viennese family. And Mom started to drift into taking care of her mother. She started to spend a lot of time, wasn't far away, on the street there in Vienna. And Mom spends a lot of time with her mother. And then she comes back and she tells me how much she doesn't enjoy it. So that's what's been going on. But now that I have seizures, Mom comes to the hospital and says to Grandma, listen, you're going to have to find something else to do because I'm busy with the seizure. Okay, so is that a meaning, a possible meaning? Is a symptom perhaps proclaiming that the family needs to find a solution for Mom and Grandma, and the symptom is a proposed solution to the problem. It's by creating a change. Well, what else is happening? You have a mother, you have a father. Well, to tell you the truth, Dad was spending a lot of extra time at work. Mom was busy with Grandma, and Dad seemed to be an awful lot at work. And he has this secretary, and Mom doesn't like the secretary. She says that she's a little flirtatious. And Dad seems to be spending a lot of time with this secretary. And so the family, you see, is not so stable right now, right? But now that I have seizures, Dad tells his secretary, you handle the business. I have to come to the hospital because my daughter needs me. She's having seizures. Oh, so when you have these seizures, we're not asking you in your dreams what they mean to you. That's a separate level of meanings. We're asking you what happens when you have a seizure, and the answer is mom is saved from grandma, and dad is saved from his secretary, or wants to be saved, or whatever, and we're a happier family by the bedside of my neurological hospitalization. Mom and dad are together, and they haven't been as much together until these seizures for a long time. You follow the story? Now, is it a believable story? Is it a believable story? Can you imagine that this is something that happens? Some of you may have had some experiences. In the best of all worlds, we'll have chairs that move quietly. What maybe we'll have here. There's still things to do. A believable story. So now, the next question is, well, what on earth can we do with this story? What are we supposed to do with the story? What are you supposed to tell the girl? That, well, keep having seizures, until mom and dad get their act together. When they finally get their act together, you can stop having seizures? That would be pretty wild, right? But you have to say that if you see a reason or see a meaning, so therapists tend to have reflexes, like I'm going to fix it, right? But we have to try to figure out how we're going to make this different. Now, the first thing to understand is that, you see, when we said that there's multiple functions, we said that there's two different sides to things. From the point of view of the drive, it can be an expression and a restraint. From the point of view of the superego, it can be an expression or a restraint. So it wouldn't surprise us if we were to say that a symptom has multiple functions in terms of change. What would be the multiple function in terms of change? That a symptom expresses the difficulties in the family, which in this case is a difficulty between mom and dad and some external pulls. It expresses what's not so good, but it also is a mechanism for changing it. A mechanism for changing it. How is it a mechanism for changing it? Well, there they are at the bedside. You see, the symptom is a pragmatic move in the family. Something is happening in the real world, the here and now, not just in the imagination, in the real world here and now. You walk into the hospital bed, the hospital ward, and by the bedside of this young girl, we have father and mother doing something jointly. If it would have occurred to Freud at the time to say, what you're doing with this seizure, is that something that you do all the time? And they would say, oh, no, not at all. We might have had family therapy 60 years earlier. Never occurred, it wouldn't have occurred to anybody in Vienna at the time. What occurred to Freud was to say, listen, spill your guts out and we'll figure it out. So you can see that a symptom, when we look at a symptom, people come in with suffering. So they say to us, take away my symptom. Well, if we were to take away the hysterical seizures, what would we end up with? Dad with the secretary, mom with grandma, right? We would take away the seizure, we take away the symptom. And the family would be in the same trouble that they were in before. So you can understand why one of Freud's observations, it wasn't a theory, it was an observation, most of Freud's observation, was that you take away one symptom, there's another symptom. You take away the girl's symptom, her younger brother gets sick, right? Well, if the symptom is trying to express the trouble, but also being a mechanism for change, so someone else will volunteer, there'll be another symptom. Unless things change in the family. Now, let's just review a couple of things. The fact that grandma is lonely, this is a nuclear family, father and mother, and this 15-year-old girl. The fact that grandma is lonely, would you call that an objective change, a pragmatic change, or a subjective change? Hello? Huh? Pragmatic. Pragmatic? Pragmatic. Anybody remember pragmatic? We just said pragmatic is like objective. It's here and now. It's in the present. But it doesn't happen in every family. It's not universal. Subjective, non-universal. Easier to use another term. We use the word pragmatic. So the fact that there's this thing going on with grandma, that's not something that happens in every family, but it happens in this family. And the fact that the girl is 15, that's an objective change. Adolescence If you recall, adolescents are the instrument. Adolescence is like one continuous symptom, right? Because adolescence, when things have to change, when adolescent says, I'm not 5 anymore, things are changing, the adolescent is asking for a change in the differentiation in the family, right? So is a symptom. A symptom is asking for a change in the differentiation in the family. And that's why if we simply give a pill and the seizure goes away, the differentiation stays where it is, right? So the symptom will not have fulfilled its function in terms of helping things to change. So far, so good? Okay? This is not a simple matter. When somebody comes in and says, I don't feel well, it's not a simple matter to say, you know, there's this famous story. Anybody ever see The Lone Ranger? This is from my childhood. It's in Mario Western. So, you know, there's the white man and the Indian, and it's a racist series, like everything from the 50s. You know, the Indian is serving the white man and creating frontiers, and in the meantime performing genocide on the Indians. It's the usual American story. And nobody's asking those questions. But at some point, there's this, you know, sort of a comic that, you know, the Indians all surround Tonto and the Lone Ranger, and it looks like they're in deep trouble. And so the Lone Ranger says to Tonto, now Tonto, what are we going to do? And Tonto turns to the Lone Ranger and says, what do you mean we, white man? And that's where it ends. So when somebody says, I don't feel well, if we can say to ourselves, what do you mean I? What do you mean I? Right? Now that's counterintuitive in our culture. Somebody doesn't feel well and comes to an individual and says, I don't feel well. So we say, well, I'm here to help you with that. But when you say, what do you mean I? What's the we? What's happening? What is this thing, you know, that your headache, when you have a headache, who do you talk to? And what does she do? And then what does he do? We'll get to that, you know, as we go along. It's what's called circular questions. It's mapping the pragmatics of the symptom. When you start to do that for the first time, you will start to feel that you've begun to learn family therapy. Before that, you will intuitively do what everybody does and say, oh, that's terrible, that's suffering, and you know, how do you feel and how do you think about it? But when you say, and when you have a headache, who brings you the pill? And when he brings you the pill, what else is he not doing when he's bringing you the pill? Right? You start to map the functions. You say, well, what do you mean I? It's not just I. That's when you start to feel like a family therapist. It'll happen, in some of you it may have started to happen. It'll take a little time. But the first time you do it, and your client says, oh, I never noticed that. Look at that. How about that? Mom and Dad are here at my bedside because I'm having seizures. They're not together any other way. Huh, I didn't notice that. So you say, oh, well, it was deeply unconscious. Remember in the first lecture we said unconscious means something in the past that you repressed. This wasn't unconscious in that dynamic sense that it was being repressed. When the person says, oh, I never noticed that, they don't say, I'm going to have an anxiety attack if I get to notice. They say, oh, that's interesting. I didn't notice that. So it wasn't, you don't need energy to begin to see what you didn't see. So it's a group process, right? Group process is you never see everything. In this room, since we're a group, nobody can see the whole process, including me. And that's what's interesting about group process. When you start to see interactions you didn't see before, you didn't see them not because you repressed them, because you didn't see them, because that's how groups are. So when the girl says, oh, I never thought of that, but then she may say, but let's not think about that. And she'll get her therapist and say, okay, sweetheart, tell me about your dreams. And then we'll leave the family alone, and we won't talk about this meaning. Yudis.
So I have a client who just came in and she has severe back pain.
Say that again?
A client who has severe back pain.
Yeah.
And so all the questions you're asking are interactional. Is it possible, like we were talking about it, that it could also just be like events that happen all at once, the science of Aliyah and college?
Everything is possible. Right. In other words, somebody comes in with back pain. When we talk about multiple functions, the word multiple is a serious word. When we see the pragmatic meanings, that doesn't erase the internal meanings. It doesn't erase the internal meanings. There's nothing that erases anything. That's what makes working with people interesting.
Do you usually, I don't mean always, but like go in the path of who helps you, who you go to, meaning could it be not an interactional symptom?
When you become a family therapist, you will start to say to yourself, I need to map what it looks like outside also. You see, because the question is, what's going to be the mechanism for change? And the assumption that if you tell me about your back pain and about what it means here and there, that's the mechanism for change, that will be true in a system that's differentiated enough so that the rest of it can change as well. Let me take your example. So this girl has let me just take your question seriously. So this girl has these seizures, and you say to her, let's talk about the past and see how the past is revisiting itself in the future, or it's being repressed, and she starts to remember things. And she stops having seizures, right? And she says to her parents, while I was thinking with Yehudis about this back pain, I had a few other thoughts as well. They came to me. They came to me about how you guys got organized around my seizures. And it made me think something that I want to tell you about. And the family says to her, wow, we never thought of that. You're right, we're going to go as a couple, we're going to try to figure it out. What's happened? This is a fable, but what's happened? The family is differentiated enough that one person can change and pass the change on to other people, right? If you think about it from the point of view of mutuality, the fact that she was able to have this conversation with you and able to think differently about herself brings her, if it's a real change in herself, to be different with her mother and with her father. So she says to Mom, listen, this business with Grandma, I'm not so sure that it's good for you or for us or for Dad. She tells her father, right? So individual change in more differentiated families gets communicated and creates the system change. So you see that it's not exclusive, but that will happen in families that are differentiated enough that individual change will allow for an increase in mutuality. Now, there are some families where the girl will say to herself, Yehudis has helped me to understand what I can understand about myself. My parents are a hopeless loss, and I can't talk to them about it. Why? Because when I talk to my mother about the therapy, she says, we paid for it, but don't take that stuff too seriously. And Dad says, look, I know that it's false. You just had false ideas. The rest of the therapy is just nonsense. Okay, so is the family creating mutuality around it? No, they're a 21st century family who knows how to resist change in more sophisticated ways, but nothing changes in the family. So then, this girl, the family hasn't added its differentiation. She doesn't have a more mutual relationship, and the change isn't communicated through the other people and in relationship with other people. And so she may end up saying, let's say she lives in New York, she says, I think I'm going to go to Jerusalem. That's the place for me. I can't stay home another minute. I think I'm just going to go to Jerusalem and let them stew. So what is she doing? In family terms, she's making a cutoff, as not a small number of people do when they move from one continent to the other. And then she comes to the next Yehudis, or let's say you move, so she comes to see you, right? And she says, I'm different, but they're not different. And you might say, could we think about that? Now that you have some more space, can you think about how you communicate with them? What is it you wanted to say to your mother you couldn't say? Why can't you say it? What would happen? Let's bring her in when she comes and we'll talk about it. We'll create change. From one change, we'll create another change, right? So you see what we're talking about here? We're not talking about the fact that you have to decide what's ideologically the better way to do therapy. That is moot, right? But you are asking for a given family what helps them to change. And it's not always true that individual change is adequate to create a change in level of differentiation. If the family is differentiated enough, it will. If they're not, we need to look at other mechanisms of change. Now, that leads us, we're going to get to it more in another lecture or two, but it leads us to the question, if she can't make the change in the family, why should we, right? In other words, why don't we just say, we know how we're doing therapy, and this family is useless. That's what Freud said. I don't know what to do with families, right? So then we condemn those families to no change because we're committed to something that works for other families and doesn't work for them. That doesn't sound so differentiated from our point of view, right? So if we were to say, well, families that, individual change communicates and generalizes, those are some families. We really like working with those families, don't we? They're more like us, we could say. We like working with those families. But there are other families where they're different, where that doesn't work. Is there another way of creating change in families where individual change by itself isn't enough? That's our question, right? This is not talking about the only mechanism of change. We're talking about an additional mechanism of change, which we'll find out, based on Eunice's question, that we're going to need for some families who are somewhat different from us. What are those families? Simple terms, those are the families that drive us crazy, right? Those are the families who we say, why can't you talk to your mother? Don't talk to me about my mother. Just talk to me about my dreams. Don't talk to me about my mother. You say, but it's your mother. Or you would say, well, the first year where I got stooped in my head so many times, level of differentiation, how's the level of differentiation going to change if it's all by yourself, right? And she says, I'm not planning to have it change. I said, that's limited. It's not worthless, but it's limited. So when Freud said 5% of the human population, which means the Jews in Vienna, 5% of people can do psychoanalysis, he was taking it seriously. He said that 5% of people who could lie on the couch 6 days a week, think about things in that way, and actually create change even in their families. Because you have to have a level of differentiation to be able to be on the couch, right? And the people who drove him crazy were people who lay on the couch and did the same thing over and over again. And if you zoom out on them, you would see the families weren't changing. And so they didn't have permission to move beyond something that's just repetitive and sounds like psychoanalysis, but is not an adequate mechanism of change for those people in their families, right? So to become family therapists means understanding that some people require changing the family as part of individual change, that they can't do it by themselves, because when they say I, we say, what do you mean I? Is that I differentiated enough to be able to be the mechanism of change by itself, or does it need the interactions in the family to be able to change? So here we're talking about changing interactions in the family, okay? So we've looked at the family and said when that might happen, and so here we have a pragmatic change and an objective change in the family, and we might find a few others in the father's family of origin if we look. This wasn't the full map. And so we say, let's see how the symptom is an expression of the need for change and the mechanism of change, the symptom itself. Dealing with the symptom is a mechanism of change. So far, so good? Okay.
I'm just trying to understand, if therapy is such a painful process, then why do people do it?
Why do people do it? That's an awfully important question, isn't it? So what do you folks think? Here you are heading to a Shavuos of your first year in family therapy theory. Why do people go through pain in order to change?
It's more painful the other way.
What's that?
It's more painful the other way. They're in pain.
But how do they know that? How do they know that it's more painful the way they are? After all, that's how they are. How do they know that something could change?
They don't feel fulfilled, they have challenges.
What's that?
They don't feel fulfilled, they have challenges, they don't find themselves, they have all different...
Right, so one of the favorite words
symptoms.
is fulfilled, right? In other words, that people feel limited, right? That's true, but the other reason is because it becomes symptomatic. And then you get to Yehuda's formulation that it's worse this way. In other words, when you're sick, you don't have any choice but to change. So the symptom pushes you. You ask this girl, who's having the seizures, how would you like your family to change? She said, I'm here to get rid of my seizures. What are you talking about? But getting rid of the seizures is the mechanism for the whole family to change. Is it conscious? No. So when you say, why do people, if you ask why do people change, but if you want to be careful with that question, say, why does a person consciously decide that they want to change? That's a very high level of differentiation. Most people do not come in with a conscious choice that they want to change. They come in because they're suffering. They can't sleep, they have anxiety, they're depressed, all of these symptoms. And then we are at the crossroads with them because we can see it as, you have a symptom, that shows that you're ready for change. The only person in the room who can see that is us. Or you have a symptom and you want not to change. You want to get rid of the symptom and stay the way you were. So whose responsibility is it to see the symptom as a mechanism of change? There's only the therapist who can see that and to try to make it work. The client never says, I have a symptom because the family's not working or because I have a need to change. They say, I'm sick, I want to feel better. That's what they say. You say, you're not actually, that's one way of looking at it, that you're sick. Or you can say the whole family's in imbalance. Tell me when you're sick, who does what? And then we'll see what this sickness means in the family. But you see, these are important questions because this is what allows us to cross the border from thinking about individuals to actually seriously thinking about families. Seriously. Because that's how these people are going to change. And doing it the other way for many families is not going to be adequate for them. It's going to keep them the same. So now we're crossing the border here. Yeah.
Last week we talked about family time. The right time to do things in families and to affect the change. So now, let's say we use the symptom. We try to lower the symptom in order to that'll be a catalyst for changing the family. And the family's like, hey, it's not family time. Right? Like this is not the right time for this to happen right now.
Right. So that's always an interesting question. And one of the things that we want to relieve ourselves from is the absurd notion that when families change, they get all fixed. They don't get all fixed. They change the level of differentiation a bit. Do they get to 100%? What did Bowen tell us? As good as it gets is about 80, right? There's always room to change, and it's always being challenged. And there will be families where we will be saying to them, this is the next lecture, not today, this is not the time to change. In other words, if we put it in terms of regulation, and if it's subjective, we would say, we need to help you to be better regulated before you go and make a jump. We don't want to dysregulate you. We want to get you back to regulation. Somebody's at the edge of jumping. There were people who said, there was a famous psychoanalyst, there's a bit of a caricature named Lacan in Paris, who, when somebody was about to jump, he would say, what's on your mind? And then the joke in Paris was that whenever you would hear a siren, it was one of Lacan's jumpers, who heard that question and jumped, right? Whereas you might say, get off the ledge and then we'll talk about it, right? As one of my supervisors, psychoanalyst, been psychoanalyst for 50 years, explained to me that one of her patients, did I tell you this, put her head in the oven, called her analyst, and said, I'm going to light the oven. And she said, he was trying to teach me something. She said, what do you think a psychoanalyst would say at that point? Oh, an oven, that's a womb, that's interesting, that's about your mother. She said, what do you think I said? I said, take your head out of the oven, right? So sometimes you need to regulate before you can go to subjectivity. And how you know that, that's something that you learn over time with families, but it's a very important question. Some families come in and it isn't the right time for them. Or maybe they can make a small increment and live with that. We'll get to that in a second. And then make another change later on. Or if you're looking at the family timeline, you may say, the first bar mitzvah is not when it's going to change. The third bar mitzvah, that's when it's going to change. Because if I look at the grandparents and I see who's going where, that's going to be the big crisis. This is just practicing, right? So you would use looking to the future. Yeah.
I didn't get that therapist from Paris, like, I didn't understand. Like people were about to kill themselves, and then he said, "What's on your mind?" And then sometimes they jumped, and sometimes they didn't jump.
Yeah, that's what you said. I mean, this is a bit of
He
character.
really let them kill
It
themselves.
wasn't his students who said it. It was the people who failed to be his students who
Oh, okay.
used to say
What
that.
was his name?
But what?
What was his name?
Jacques Lacan. Yeah.
So as a therapist, how do you know, like, when you need regulation? Is that based on symptoms?
Say what?
Like, how do you know when to need regulation?
We're going to get to that. Okay. You see, it's good that your questions are anticipating. Let's go a little bit further, and let's go a little bit further because I think that you're on the right line. But if we go a little further, we'll go all together. So you remember this awful word, schismogenesis? Genesis means to create, like the book of Genesis, and schismo is a split. So schismogenesis are the two ways that Bateson, for those of you who have ever looked at any of Lynn Hoffman's chapters, got to do it sometime if you want to feel that you're confident as a family therapist, that there are two kinds of splits. The one split is the one we spent a lot of time on, called the complementary split. The complementary split is one where things just go around in a circle. You remember the John and Eleanor, right? From the family crucible. So John and Eleanor were just going around in circles because one would have a minus and then it would go to the other one and go back. And so that is what is referred to in the cybernetic language of the 70s, which still haunts family therapy. So you got to learn a couple terms. They're long, but they don't bite. This is what's called a negative feedback loop. Why is it negative? Because it goes to the opposite. And it's also called the deviation correction system, because the deviation is that Eleanor feels abandoned, and it's corrected by John feeling engulfed. And then that's the deviation. It's corrected by switching to the other deviation. So it's called a deviation correction or negative feedback loop. You just, in your spare time, look at the slide until you get it right. Right. And the other form of schismogenesis, which is the one we're talking about now, because this is stable, right? This is stable, is what's called the symmetrical loop. And if you recall, that's the simplest way of looking at it is, for those of you who recall it or read about it in history, America had enough missiles to blow up the world 2 times. So Russia, the Soviet Union, had enough missiles to blow up the world 3 times. Now that is deviation amplification, getting worse, right? And it's also called positive feedback. What's positive about it? That you're doing the same, more of the same, right? In other words, so then, if Russia could blow up the world 3 times, America would have to have enough missiles to blow up the world 4 times. And if America blew up the world 4 times, so the Soviet Union had to be able to blow up the world 5 times. And so then America had to be able to blow up the world 6 times. And at some point, people ran out of money. And that's what's called change. In other words, the deviation amplification system, or a positive feedback system, is one that if you look at it, if it's about blowing up the world, it's a pretty risky business. But it's what not only enables change, it requires change. It makes change possible. So a lot of times what you'll see is that you'll have a system that is... Oh, okay. So, go. The air conditioning is not working.
There is an air conditioner on order and hasn't yet been installed, so it's coming hopefully.
הם מחממים, כן. מחממים. Okay, so תודה שבאת. So deviation amplification and positive feedback, they scare the daylights out of therapists. Because the family comes in and says it's getting worse, and it keeps getting worse. But That's what enables change. And sometimes you have to get the X marks the next spot to be able to have things change. So crises, a lot of times, although, as a therapist, you say the crisis is, that's the symptom. We better get this crisis to calm down. What you sometimes end up doing by calming down the crisis is putting it back into this complementary form. And then people are totally stuck. Instead of seeing it through, if the person is not on the ledge and the head is not in the oven, and seeing it through to the possibility of change. Everything has to change when the system is no longer working. Okay, so those are terms that you'll need to understand. But what I want to do now is to present you a case. I gave them biblical names, but just take that in a humoristic way. This is the first strategic therapy. It's a therapy that took place, it's reported in this book. You have it to read. It's Xerox from this book. There are copies in the library of this book. It's called Uncommon Therapy. It's the first presentation to the world of the work of Milton Erickson. It was done by J. Haley. Just a word about Erickson and Haley. Milton Erickson was probably the most creative therapist to ever live. He was a maverick. He was hated by very many people, but he created, in the late 20th century, created work for about 50 brilliant workers, all of whom were trying to figure out what on earth he was doing. Erickson was one of the few psychiatrists who was not Jewish, he learned psychoanalysis like everybody else, but he thought it was limited. And he went back and developed hypnosis. And everything good we know about hypnosis comes from Erickson. And his collected works are about 5 volumes. Most of them are about hypnosis. But he wasn't doing just hypnosis. He was doing things that he didn't understand. He was very intuitive. Why was he so intuitive? Because he suffered from polio twice. The first time when he was a child, and the second time when he was an adolescent. He got a second bout with polio. And in order to heal himself, he walked through the woods until his legs healed. So he was somebody who knew something about himself. It sounds like he was living in the Midwest, but his head was in the Arctic. But he lived in, he knew a lot about himself. And when he would use hypnosis, he would use it in a way that would create change in a strange way, in a paradoxical way, in a way that played with language, in a way that made the role of the therapist awfully flexible. And so people used to go to Erickson. He was living out in Phoenix, Arizona, because he had trouble breathing. And his voice, this is what he sounded like. Don't listen to his tapes. He had a bit of a problem with his vocal cords. And people would go and say, Erickson, what's the secret? What is your theory? If you tell us your theory, we will know how to do it. And he looked at people incredulously and said, I love theories. I love theories so much, I make one up for each case. And that's something that it would be good to learn. This is a course on theory? Okay, so there's a course on theory, and there's what Erickson says, which is beyond theory. In the end, you can learn all of his theory as much as you want. When you're sitting with a client, it comes together or it doesn't. And it needs a piece of you because it's mutual. It has to do with people. Anyway, Erickson was extraordinary. He would solve the cases nobody could solve. And people wanted to know how. So J. Haley was one of the founders of family therapy in America. Haley was also very intuitive. Haley was very creative, and he was also very angry, probably at his psychoanalyst. Most of the people who started family therapy were angry with their analysts and wanted to show why that's a bunch of nonsense. They weren't so much into multiple function, they were into this or that. And the idea was that this is better than that. It's one of the weaknesses of family therapy that we haven't yet recovered from. And Haley used Milton Erickson to show an alternative of therapy. He couldn't possibly do this himself because nobody could do it. But Erickson had a whole lifetime of cases. So Haley wrote up these stories of Milton Erickson and presented him as a magician. And when I was first handed this book by my first family therapy supervisor, he said, Erickson was not a magician. Haley wishes he were a magician. Erickson just worked very, very hard to get to what he got to. And all of the work is missing from the book, just the results. So I'll give you an example. Erickson was a psychiatrist. He was working in the wards of Worcester State Hospital in Western Massachusetts. And a person came in, a schizophrenic, who was speaking word salad. Word salad means that there's no connection between the words. You can't possibly understand it. And Erickson was supposed to treat this guy. So Erickson went home and spent probably 40 hours working on himself until he had his own word salad. He created his own word salad. And then the client would speak the word salad to him for about 10 minutes, and Erickson would look at the clock and speak to him word salad for 10 minutes. It will take you at least 40 hours to do this if you try to create it. It's not some sort of magic. But he created his own words. And the client looked at the doctor and said, okay. Looked at his watch and talked to him for 4 hours, word salad. Erickson, when he finished, looked at his watch and talked to him for 4 hours, word salad. The next day, the client spoke for 7 hours, word salad. Erickson looked at his watch and talked to him for 7 hours in word salad. The next day, the client spoke for 45 minutes in word salad, looked at his watch. Erickson looked at his watch and started word salad, and the client, who was supposed to be a hopeless schizophrenic, said, "Doctor, can we just talk sense?" Now, did Erickson know that was going to happen? How would you know it's going to happen? Why would you put in all that effort to do something that you don't know is going to happen? Because you love theory enough to love the person who is driving you crazy and to use yourself in a way that uses his symptom. You see, everybody else was running away from the symptom. Everybody else was saying, you have to talk sense. But me, I talk sense. You're crazy. I'm going to tell you to be like me. Erickson said, symptoms probably aren't that way. Maybe you need to teach me to be like you. Let me try that, right? And so he was anything but a magician, but he was very flexible. And so this is the first, what's called strategic therapy. I gave them names so they'd be familiar with.
What's the name?
Milton Erickson. Erickson, the way the Americans spell it, or the
therapy, what did you just say?
Strategic.
Strategic therapy.
The name of the book is Uncommon Therapy. The therapy we're going to learn from it is what's called strategic therapy. And we'll see why. Strategic therapy uses the symptom. It's not, you don't have to do word salad, but, so here we have this family. I gave them some names that might be familiar to you. And here are some triangles. There's 12-year-old Miriam and 9-year-old we don't know actually how old Miriam was, but Aaron was 3 years older than Moshe. So they have this bridge, the two of them, that he's the baby, right? The two older siblings look at him as the baby. And it turns out that this is a matrilineal family, that Yocheved and her grandmother and Miriam all don't think so well of men. After all, she's referred to as Bat Levi, she has her own. So there's this sense that men can't expect too much of them. Central triangles. There's a bunch of possible triangles. There's a triangle of Amram and his 70-year-old mother, who he's very involved with, and Yocheved. There's a triangle of Yocheved and her 60-year-old mother and Amram. There's a triangle of Amram, Moshe, and Yocheved. There's a triangle of Amram, Yocheved, and Miriam, right? And there's more triangles. If you look for but what's the central triangle in this family? The central triangle, Moshe proclaims by being a bishop. He wets the bed. Now, if you ask him for dreams, just take this lightly, he says he has his dreams of floating on a basket, you know. So, but he wets the bed, and that's a problem. And what does this bedwetting express? Oh, well, it's a symptom. Well, if it's a symptom, then it's going to express what's troublesome in the family, and it's going to be the mechanism to change what's troublesome in the family, okay? So let's have a look. But since we're talking about a central triangle, let's say and this is central to this way of thinking, that the symptom will express both the difficulty and the possibility of change in the three dyads of the central triangle. Right? In other words, we're not talking about Moshe and his wet sheets. We're talking about Moshe's relationship to Yocheved. We're talking about his relationship to his father, and we're talking about the couple. That's the central triangle. So in each of the dyads of the central triangle, remember what triangles do? They distract people from mutual change. They distract people from being able to speak in dyads and co-create. So the triangle will be connected to all three dyads, and in each dyad, the symptom will express the problem and propose a solution. Okay? If you see this map, this is what would lead you to say, tell me, Moshe, it's wet when you wake up in the morning, who comes to your bed? Mother! And then when mother takes care of your sheets, what is happening? Dad is yelling at her. He's yelling at her, he's keeping him a baby, I can't stand it. And then he slams the door and leaves. And what happens to you and father? I don't see him too much. He says, when you stop wetting the bed, I'll talk to you, we'll play soccer, but not until then. Okay, so we're mapping three dyads in a central triangle. If you think about a central triangle, it gives you numbers you can control. If you look at the whole family, you're going to have numbers you can't control. So you look at the central triangle. Now, how is it in the dyad of Yocheved and Amram that the couple, how is the symptom expressing the problem? We fly on the wall, and we hear Amram saying to Yocheved, I know he's your baby, but he has to stop being your baby. He's 6 years old. Stop babying him. And frankly, until you stop babying him, I can't talk to you about anything else. I can't talk to you at all. And Yocheved said, you are no help at all. You're his father. Why do you think it's the mother's problem? Why do you baby him? Because you don't pay attention to him. You've heard of this from your neighbors every now and then. So we're saying that the symptom is expressing the difficulty in this dyad. Okay? How could the symptom possibly be a solution? How could the bedwetting be a solution? Well, if we said to ourselves, tell you what, let's say they come to one of you, say we have this kid who's bedwetting, and you imagine the central triangle, you map it, you get the picture, and you say, frankly, I think we're going to have to have Amram involved here. If Dad isn't involved, it probably isn't going to work as well. Let's see if, Dad could be the solution to this problem. So you're changing something here where between Amram and Yocheved, instead of neutralizing and distancing Amram, the enuresis is an instrument for bringing him in as part of the solution to what? To the enuresis. You're not saying, let's talk about Amram, let's talk about your dad, let's talk about Levi, let's talk about, Yaakov. Let's just talk about what you can do for the enuresis. Are you willing to be my partner? And that changes what goes on between Amram and Yocheved. I just want to... And then you would say, well, all right, what about between Amram and Moshe? Well, the same thing. The enuresis is expressing the fact that Dad is distant. But obviously, if you're making Dad a part of the solution, so you're bringing Dad in to solve the enuresis, but you need the enuresis to do it, right? And you can figure out that the same is true of Yocheved and Moshe, that she's been infantilizing him, so he wets his bed, right? But what are we going to do now? We're going to find a way in which Yocheved can take a break from this, because Amram's going to replace her, and we're going to create a change in the central triangle, right? How are we going to do it? If you came to us and said, Moshe is, we think Moshe is being infantilized, we probably wouldn't succeed. So Moshe creates enuresis, and through treating the symptom, that's the mechanism for the change, which I'll show you in a minute, because this is Erickson's case. Let's just talk about change for a minute. You have enuresis. What would be first order change? Remember we talked about first and second order change? In family therapy, what's called first order change is superficial change. The symptom goes away. It didn't have to be that way. It might have been the first order is more deep, but we refer to it this way. First order change. So Moshe is wetting the bed. Let's give him a pill so he won't wet the bed. Or let's give him a bell to wake him up so he won't wet the bed. Or let's have him not drink after 3 in the afternoon, dry him up. Or let's do it, when I was a pediatrician, we used to have this marvelous way of doing it, which was based on incorrect physiology, but it worked. Everything in primary enuresis works 70% of the time and washes out over 3 months. Everything, all of these things. So if you want to work 70% of the time, but have it not last, you can do any one of these, right? What we used to do is say to the kid, listen, we're going to do Olympics here with your bladder. You know, you're going to stretch your bladder. It's a bunch of nonsense, but you're going to stretch your bladder. So when you come home from school, you're going to drink and drink and drink until you can't drink no more. And then you're going to hold and hold and hold until you can't hold it no more. And then that's going to stretch your bladder. And by the way, we're going to measure how much you put out in a flask that happens to be rather phallic. And so you're going to show your mother that you're having a larger column of bishaks, and that's going to, and then you stretch your bladder. It's physiological nonsense, but it works 70% of the time and washed out over 3 months. Or you can do what the kibbutzim did, which is say, you wet the bed, you do your own laundry. And then Moshe stops wetting the bed because he hates doing the laundry. Or we can do what they do in Israel now. Israel is the world's leader in treating enuresis with what's called, in Israel it's called minirin. It's a small peptide, which is, it's called the desmopressin or antidiuretic hormone that the posterior pituitary puts out when you are starting to be, when you need to preserve fluids. And it gives a message to the kidneys to stop creating urine. What happens is that the blood flow in the body goes through the kidneys at a huge rate. And the kidneys preserve most of the fluid. And the way they do it is because they have this thing called ADH, which makes them reabsorb. When you stop having ADH, you can just imagine you need to pee every 20 minutes when you overdrink. So minirin will keep you dry, right? And why is Israel the leader in it? Because enuresis was discovered during the Second World War when the draft of servicemen in America was diminished by 1.5% to 2%, which is a huge amount of manpower, because of bedwetting. Bedwetting, primary bedwetting at the age of 6 is 10%. It goes down by 1% every year until about, but it's still there about 1 or 2% at 18. And the Americans weren't going to have any wet sleeping bags. Israel, it's a dry country. We don't mind having wet sleeping bags, so we draft young men who still have enuresis. We're the only people on the planet to do that, and we draft everybody. So what do we do with the wet sleeping bags? We give them this ADH so that they won't create urine at night. It's not physiologic, but Beseder, that's Israel is the world's leader in this particular treatment. What will it do? It will stop the bedwetting. But what about the central triangle? What about the change of differentiation? What about the co-creation in the diets? So that would be secondary order. The second order solution would be that, as we saw, that the father is more involved, he's closer to his son, and that Yocheved sees him as growing more. That would be a change in 3 diets in the central triangle. Now, what's the relationship between first order and second order change? A worthy question, right? Why one of your hands didn't show up, I don't know. I hope I haven't lost you. It can be one way or the other. It could be that first order change creates second order change. Is that possible? Let's say I'm going to be the doctor and I'm going to give this kid the minirin. Now the question would be, how am I going to give him minirin? Not whether I'm going to. I want him to stop urinating in bed, But I can say to him, I'll tell you what, I think that your father should give you the pill. And would be, and I'm going to set up the father for success. I said, you know, he wants to have a man pill, right? So you give him the pill, and the two of you, you know, talk about whatever it is that you talk about, but spend about 10 minutes, you know, around the time taking the pill. So you're doing second order change around the first order change, right? And then you stop peeing, and if the family is differentiated enough, Yocheved will start to say, look at that. My husband was successful. That's good for me. If she's competitive, it's not going to work. That's good for me. He's more engaged. We might tell Amram, you know, after you do father-son talk, make sure you tell your wife what you talked about. So she's part of the picture. And she looks at Moshe and says, he's growing up. How about that? I guess I'm going to let him have that soccer chug after all. And so first order change creates second order change. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that, and usually people try first order change first. The other possibility is that you do second order change, and then the first order change takes place without your trying to do it. In other words, you bring them into family therapy and talk about the relationships and say, you know, to Amram, you know, put yourself in gear here. You're a father, you're a husband, and tell me about what it was like when you're with your father and what you're overcoming, blah, blah, blah. These things change. Nobody's talking about bedwetting, because we tell them, tell you what, first we do this, and then we'll deal with the bedwetting. It'll work better if we do this first. Most families will accept it. You do second order change, and they come back and say, well, he stopped peeing, so, you know, we don't need to do anything about it. And that would be expectable if we say that it's a symptom, we've changed it, okay? So you can work first order change to second, or second order change to first, okay? Yeah.
I wanted to ask what you were saying about the central triangle and how the father needs to be more involved. So, like when we were learning about triangulating, like a couple months ago,
Say it again, what?
we were learning about like triangulating, that it's not healthy to triangulate in third person. So, for example, I'm seeing a couple, whatever, but the mom was having an issue with the daughter. Like, they just weren't getting along. And what was happening was the mother kept asking the father to get involved. And to me, that didn't sound very healthy. I told the mother, like, you have to deal in a diet with your daughter. Like, don't keep pulling the father in because you can't deal with her. Like, you need to work it out with her. You need to.
So you're using language of higher differentiation, right? Because there's a clear triangle, and you think that by talking with her about the triangle, she can change the triangle. That would be wonderful, but it's also possible that she can't do it. And then the question is, now what do you do? So let's say that you talk to her, you know, for 6 months about changing the triangle. She doesn't know what you're talking about. She humors you, but she doesn't do it. And she doesn't do it because when she goes home, the other two characters are there, and they do what they used to doing. So then you would think about, how can I have whatever the symptom is be a vehicle for change for all of them together? See, when you change the central triangle in this way, you do it simultaneously, you do it all together. You made all three change at once. You're trying to change one, you're trying to change the spouse dyad and assume that that will generalize, but it may not, right? In other words, if you're doing for example, when you do couples therapy, you assume that when you do couples therapy or parental counseling, that what you do in the room will change what happens at home when the kid is there. It may or may not, right? You don't want to get into theory about what it has to be. It's true that the parents were allowed before the kid, but it's also true that the kid is an active participant in what's going on. So there will be times where you can work on the couple and the child will change, and there will be other times when you need to do something different. That's what we're trying to learn out. What you do when the differentiation isn't enough for individual change, or talking about the one dyad to create change. So you change the whole central triangle together. Yeah?
So in such a case, what will you do?
What?
What will you do in such a case? I mean, the
What would you do in
parents
such
are
a
trying
case?
to change, but when they go home to their kid,
Right.
it doesn't change.
You bring them all in together.
Bring them all together.
Yeah, that's what family therapists do.
And what if they don't?
That's one of the reasons you do family therapy. What kind of family therapy? That's 3 lectures from now. But you bring
So
them in all
you'll
together.
include the children in the change.
Yeah, you change the relationships. You create the mutuality where it wasn't in vivo, because thinking about it isn't enough for them. It's enough for you, but it's not enough for them. So we do something different. Eunice?
A few questions on first order and second order. Does it happen organically, like with each client it works different, or with some clients the second order is more
You're
regulation?
ahead of us, we'll get there. Okay. Now, here, this is the next slide. I should go off, right? So now they go to the Professor Pipi at Hadassah, who has a clinic for Pipi, and Yocheved goes to Professor Pipi and says, my kid is bedwetting. And Professor Pipi says, I'm a professor of this, so here's what you're doing. He said, he gives the mini ring, that any family doctor would give beseder. So now, and Yocheved says to the professor, you're really wonderful. Sometimes that happens to professors. He says, you're really wonderful. You listen to me the way my husband doesn't listen to me, and you're willing to see that my kid is really like a baby, so he needs a pill. And so I'm just going to keep coming to you so you can help me to understand how much my husband and my boy are a loser. She doesn't say it that way, but she says how much my husband can't be bothered to come, and my kid needs a pill in order to have a dry belly. But you're wonderful. Okay, so Professor Pipi has now created a triangle outside of the family, which reinforces the triangle in the family. And so, as a result, we're going to dry up the bed. We're going to dry up the bed and have first order change, which is going to block second order change. That's a danger, right? When you do first order change and you don't understand that the symptom is also interactive, in families in lower differentiation, you become a triangle, you become an obstacle to change. Well, how can you be an obstacle to change if the bed is dry? Because father now says to the kid, take your pill and talk to me when you don't need a pill. And the mother says to the father, Professor Pipi doesn't speak to me that way. He really cares. And he says, okay, I'll be home late tonight. When you start talking about Professor Pipi, I'll be back. So you've done, and this happens all the time, I have to say, this is not something that I'm making up. If you're committed to first order change and you don't see where you're fitting into the system, you can become an obstacle. In other words, you now have, in the 12 steps is called the dry alcoholic, you now have a dry anuretic, right? The bed is dry, but he's an anuretic because he's taking the pill. And it's the same difference, except that now it can't be fixed because you've paralyzed the symptom. The symptom was a possible mechanism for change in this family, and you paralyzed it by creating first order change and creating something static, but there's no symptom anymore. So there's nothing, so you've stabilized a difficult family. Let me tell you the story, because I want you to meet Milton Erickson. This will take about 5 minutes. I hope it will amuse you. This was the first strategic therapy ever done. It was before anybody knew what strategic therapy was. It was not conceptualized in central triangles. Nobody was talking about co-creation. Nobody was talking about differentiation. Erickson just made it up whole cloth. Looking back at it 60 years later, the kid who was treating his grandchildren, maybe great-grandchildren, hopefully, he can look at it and say, this was the first strategic therapy. The mother comes in and says, my husband doesn't help me at all with this enuresis. Erickson said to her, this is what hypnotists do, he said, your husband is so involved in this that we don't even have to talk about him. Now, how does that work? She doesn't want to talk about him. And she says he's outside. Erickson said he's outside as a sign that he's so far inside. And if that works, that's a paradoxical suggestion, which people do in hypnosis. So Amram became engaged by his not being engaged. Okay, that you have to learn a little hypnosis to know how that works. But let's say that the first thing he did was to get Amram engaged, because that's what he said to the mother. He said to her, you really want to forget him, right? So I'm going to go along with what you want to do, but add my own meaning to it. And I put that meaning to it, you'll accept it because you want me to accept what you want me to do. We are going to forget your husband because he's so deeply involved. That works. So Amram is deeply involved because he's not there. then he sees that this mother is into belly aching. She likes to complain. She's complaining. He says, you know, you're not suffering enough. That's what he said to her. He said, you know, this is a vehicle for change, this suffering. We need to make it more. So here's the deal. You have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to check the kid and see if the bed is wet. So now she has more to complain about. So he's using the way it's going. And here's the deal. If he's wet, then we have to do handwriting practice. No. She's going to the doctor and giving him authority to give her a prescription. So she doesn't argue with him the way all of you would and say, what are you talking about? What's that with handwriting? She wants a prescription. She's giving him that role. He says, fine, here's the prescription. When he gets up at 5 and the bed is wet, ignore the bed, get up and have him practice his handwriting. His handwriting needs improvement, right? She's there with the kid, and the kid says, okay. In other words, he's working within the system how it is. So he's going to practice his handwriting. When you practice your handwriting, do you get to be infantilized, or do you get to grow up? You grow, right? In other words, the result of bedwetting is not infantilization, it's the opposite. And the mother who wants to suffer is going to suffer more by having her son grow up under her tutelage at 5 in the morning because he's wet. So the symptom is adopting a different meaning. And if he's dry, then you can all go back to sleep, right? That's what's known these days as win-win, right? In other words, the symptom now becomes absolutely superfluous because it doesn't do anything. You grow if you have the symptom, you grow if you don't have the symptom, right? And he's giving her the prescription. She is accepting because she gave him the role. Doctor, give me a prescription. And then, you see, what will happen? What is Yocheved's experience of herself as a mother? Or in our terms, what is Yocheved's co-creation with her boy? Success. Success. He's either dry, so she's made him dry, or he's wet and she's helping him to do handwriting, right? So she's starting to have it, he's changed that dyad. He changed the first dyad because he said Amram is engaged. So he changed the dyad of Yocheved and Amram. And now that she's succeeding, then tell your husband how you succeeded and maybe go out and celebrate with him, how you've succeeded. So how does it, what's happening now? Amram is engaged in giving his blessing by not being involved in this therapy. And what's going to happen between Yocheved and Amram? He's going to see her instead of as his failure, stupid, infantilizing, smartut. He sees her as a mother who's really successful. And you see that the professor did not become Professor Pipi. He didn't say, I'm solving it. He gave them this really so-called weird thing to do. What does handwriting have to do with enuresis? No one has never written a paper about the relationship between handwriting and enuresis, although a Freudian might now say, well, using your hand, that's, you know, we know what the hand represents. Beseder, that could be there too, multiple function, right? But he's created a change in the system. And if you look at it, you see that had he used our terms of central triangle, 3 dyads, second order change by way of the symptom, that he's created a strategic therapy. So that I wanted you to see as, and the next step that we were going to do next time. A couple of questions, then we got a break. Yeah.
When he said that I was so engaged that
right.
he believed it?
Yes.
On what basis?
What?
On what basis?
Not a legal
Intuition?
basis. No, hypnosis works on suggestion. It's what you do when you want the judge to, and you want him not to ask, you want him just to, suggestion. So when he says it, as I said, the notion of it is that she wants him to forget about Amram. And he says, I'm going to do what you want, but I'm going to attach the meaning to it. I'm going to talk, no, we're not going to talk about Amram because he's so deeply engaged. So she accepts the extra meaning. You know,
she accepts it, but when he says he's so engaged, is he really?
What?
The suggestion with her words, I get that.
But at that moment, that's his engagement from the point of view of the central triangle. That's enough to get things to move. You see, he's avoiding the problem of saying it's you and me against them. right? He's avoiding the Professor Peepee triangle.
I understand he's avoiding it, but is he avoiding it on the basis of truth, or he's suggesting to her,
Truth.
convincing her?
Truth. This is what's called flexible truth. In other words, it's a meaning that, you know, it's a, you could call it a spar or how I mean, it's something that you use to get further, right? It's not the final God knows what.
And that's legitimate. Because-
What?
And that's legitimate.
It's useful. You'll decide if it's legitimate. All of this comes down to a big discussion about strategic therapy, which we'll get to at some point, which is this a manipulation? Are we manipulating our clients? We'll get to that, but we're not quite ready yet. Yeah?
Is Erickson sharing any of his thoughts behind what he's doing
Say
with?
it again.
Is he sharing any of his thought process behind what he's telling him to
No.
do with the client?
No, no, he's not, because the family is not at the level of differentiation, I would say, but that's going to be helpful for them. See, we would like our clients to be like ourselves. We would like to be transparent and tell them how the therapist is thinking, and that's going to create some sort of a change, different level of differentiation. This lady is saying, tell me what to do, and she's not saying, help me to think and feel. She's saying, tell me what to do. And so he says, I guess that's my job. And if I say, no, we don't tell you what to do around here, we talk about feelings that I'm not helping her because that's not what she needs now. That's the question of responsibility that cuts both ways. Two more questions, then I want you to do practice, yeah.
So it's a bit of a risk what you did, because it could have totally backfired. Like, it was brilliant, but what if she had become totally sleep deprived and angry and exhausted and got the husband involved and said, you need to get up at 5 in the morning.
Erickson then would have said, I have more to learn about this family. That's what's called a heuristic move. Heuristic means it teaches you something, right? So when you do a strategic therapy, you don't do it so it's going to work. Sometimes it works, and sometimes what happens what you say, and they say, there's something I didn't understand, grandma's involved. Fine. And then we say, but you say, I missed something, here's the answer, right? So it teaches you something. Yeah.
So what happens if the symptom, I know the symptom is like a window into understanding the family. What happens when the symptom like is creating too much crisis or chaos? Is there a place to like calm down the symptom, or that's going to only work in a highly differentiated family?
Okay, so
Because then they will realize there's more there.
Right, so the question that always comes up when you're tweaking the differentiation a bit is how you tweak it more, right? In other words, okay, so now he's writing and she's not infantilizing him in the family. Is that the end of therapy? Is that it? Is that all we want to do? That's a deep question. All of the strategic therapists fell into the hole of saying if that's what the client wants, that's all they need. That's, I think, a loop in the therapist's mind. It would be more useful to zoom out and say, they were at a level of differentiation that required this kind of therapy at the beginning. And now that they've changed, and now that they're out of that, triangle, can we move it further? Could we, for example, invite Amram and Yocheved in to debrief about what they learned about the therapy and start to push for the next level of change and differentiation? If you know a good reason why not, I mean, it may not work, it may not be right for them, but why would we want to say no symptom, everything is fine?
No, I'm not saying, I'm saying the family might think, okay, there's no symptom, there's no issue, but like a higher difference. So then I can see why you'd want to keep the symptom alive.
Yes, that's the danger.
But I'm saying a family who's highly differentiated, where the symptom goes away, but they still know there's more to work on.
That's fine, then they come, and a strategic therapist would say to them, which is one of the difficulties with strategic therapists who were impossible. They were brilliant, they were very helpful to certain families, and they were impossible people, is to say, change your form of therapy now. The therapy now, you have a higher level of differentiation. They're asking things about themselves. Don't do strategic therapy anymore. Do the next level of
Right,
therapy.
because the symptoms could add more chaos.
Yeah. So we're going to get to that. But first, now you have some time in which I want you to do the following. I want you to take a child in your future family. Pick a time, any time. It could be your children, it could be your grandchildren, it could be grandchildren you don't have yet. Just fictionalize it and create a 6-year-old boy who's wetting the bed and draw what the triangle might be and how it would relate to some central triangle, just to sort of practice this situation as a common situation, and try to see the bedwetting as an expression of something that needs to change, as a mechanism of change, and not just as a symptom that needs to be taken away. Just as a practice, fictionalize your families. And if you want to, you can do it in the 1800s, back in God knows where. If you want to, you can do it 2 generations forward. If you want to be brave, you can take one of your kids and, think about if you had a symptom, what would it mean, right? But you're going to need half an hour for that. So, one last question.
Does that mean that every symptom is an expression of something
okay.
psychopathology in the
Right.
family?
You see, we are very intelligent people here, and so we ask very intelligent questions. It's a very intelligent question, right? Intelligent questions always go from the specific to the general, right? And so your words were, does that mean that every symptom is, right? And the answer is we don't know. There are certainly symptoms that seem to work this way, and when you work with them this way, you get a kind of change you don't get in another way. Does it mean that every symptom is always a central triangle that needs to be changed? I don't know. It would be reasonable to say that there is nothing that happens that doesn't have meaning, right? In other words, let's say that you later discover that Moshe had a physiological reason. This is this rare thing that people look for every now and then. Everybody goes to urologist, nobody finds out anything, 1 in 1,000. He's the one. So it's in his body, right? And then you would say, oh, well, that we can't account for the symptom by this central triangle, but is the symptom then without meaning in the central, And the answer is that physiological things create meanings as well. And so the issue of absolute causality is moot. You work with it and you see. You wouldn't like to send Moshe, you wouldn't like to do Eric's therapy until you made sure that the kid was well, right? If he had diabetes and that's why he was peeing, it's not going to work. But symptoms, even when the physiological, have meaning. When we talked about the psychosomatic diabetes with Minuchin, if you recall, that was diabetes, but it adopted a family meaning. A kid has asthma, but when he's wheezing, it organizes the family in a certain way. Higher level differentiation families do it when they're dealing with the asthma, then go back to their regular level. Lower differentiation families, it lowers the differentiation, even though they didn't necessarily create the asthma. So the issue of meaning and the fact that things get organized around meaning, that's how families are. And then you have to assume responsibility to figure what's reasonable to do. So have a good time reading this. It's in the syllabus. And do something with your families and see what it does.
What does it help to give the mother a task that's going to bring up the child if all she knows how to do is infantile the child, which means so wake up the mother and they'll start doing practicing and she'll go further.
Because the mother, in the symptom, the mother is asking to change that. You see the symptom as a mechanism of change, then you say that if we work with the symptom in a way that helps her to change through the symptom is doing the work, not the doctor, the symptom.
The mother is also intuiting that something is...
What you're asking is the next question, which will be at the beginning of next lecture, is what if this doesn't work? There's an answer to that too.
This book is going to help us become
What?
This book is going to help us become strategic.
Oh, one last question. Gabriel's asking a question that's very important for all of you. Some of you want to become therapists, right? Maybe all of you. So Gabriel's asking, is reading this book going to help you become therapists? It's going to make you very insecure, and it's going to tickle your imagination. That's what's called learning.
But I mean, is there a book that's more, that gives you more of the theory of...
Yeah. I mean, look at the syllabus. Put it this way, there's a bunch of books that tell you how to do strategic therapy. None of them talk about central triangles, none of them talk about co-creation, none of them talk about the symptom as a change in the central triangle. We're putting two things together here. You want to read the strategic therapist, they're in the syllabus. Haley has a book, his ex-wife had a book. They threw the books at each other. Yeah.
Just as a family therapist, like thinking about overfunction and underfunction with Amram and Yocheved, I would think it's more simple to just let Yocheved say to her husband, you're right, I'm not going to maybe you can take care of it.
Right, that's another possibility. It would depend on the level of differentiation of the family.
You mean
Because
that's,
that's a co-creation. Can she do it? Will it generalize? Those are the
even in
questions.
a low differentiation family, you can say, oh, you're right, I can't do it. Why do you have to be so low?
We'll get to that next time. What you're doing now is resisting doing it with your own families. Go do it with your own families.